to this lecture this evening. It's a little early to talk about when the lecture is concluded, but right now I'm going to say when we're finished with the lecture and questions, you're invited into our lower hall for refreshments, and you can go by these doors, and there's also an elevator through this door. I'm going to invite Pat Lee, the Director of Development for the Faculty of Humanities, to come forward and share a brief word with us. Pat.
Thank you, Reverend Vincent. I've been working with the Chair of Christian Thought Fund Development Committee for the past 8 months to increase the Chair's endowment to sustain the program's operations and public programming activities. As you may know, the current operation of the Chair is through its endowment, but also from a bequest given from a donor's estate. His gift is helping to support the costs of these wonderful evenings of learning and discussion. Tonight you see very tangible and lasting legacy from a donor who made a planned gift to the University of Calgary, and I hope you will consider how you might be able to make a similar positive impact through your estate planning. I also wanted to mention very briefly that we've been having success with gifts to the Chair's endowment. As you may have noticed on the donor boards at the entrance this evening, the lists of names of supporters are growing for both the Legacy Circle program and larger donations to the Chair's endowment. After Doug's lecture, I'll be around for the reception. I have some literature on planned giving, and if you would want to discuss with me any gifts, opportunities that you might like to give to the Chair, I'm happy to discuss that with you. Thanks.
Our guest this evening is Dr. Douglas Shantz. In 1987, Doug Shantz completed his PhD in Reformation history at the University of Waterloo, Ontario. For 13 years, he taught at Trinity Western University in Langley, BC, in the area of Christianity and culture. Since the summer of 1999, Doug has held the Chair of Christian Thought in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Calgary. In this unique position, his involvements include teaching in the history of Christianity, supervising graduate students, as well as research and writing. His research regularly takes him to libraries and archives in various parts of Germany. A unique aspect of the Chair of Christian Thought is its role in bridging religious studies within the larger Calgary community through sponsoring lectures and public events. The Chair typically hosts 4 lectures per year by leading academics who address issues of current Christian and social interest. This evening, Doug speaks to us on the subject, "What are they saying about conversion?" He challenges us to deepen and broaden our understanding of the key religious experience in the Christian tradition. Would you please welcome Dr. Douglas Shantz.
Thank you, Reverend Vincent. It's a pleasure to be here at St. Giles Presbyterian Church and to see such a good audience for this lecture. And I do want to begin with some thank yous. It's hard for me to believe in some ways that this is 7 years for me in the Chair of Christian Thought. And I am grateful to the University of Calgary for this opportunity I've had to serve in this chair, and I hope it'll be for many years to come. I'm also grateful for some outstanding people that I have the privilege of working with in serving in this amazing opportunity. If you look at the back of your program, you get some idea of what I'm talking about. Because there is a list there at the top half of members of an advisory council that I meet with monthly in planning events like this. They give me all kinds of input, all kinds of support. A key aspect of this chair is a sense of accountability to the Calgary Christian community. This chair was launched thanks to the giving and the gifts of the Calgary Christian community. So it's only appropriate that in fulfilling this role, there's a sense of accountability and cooperation. I'm certainly not a one-man show, and I hope I don't appear to be anything like that. We meet monthly, and you can see that this advisory council is drawn from a wide cross-section of Calgary churches. And And it's just, for me, it's one of the highlights of my experience in this chair, is working with this amazing, highly functional, collegial group of representatives. And then the bottom half of this sheet as well lists people who have a special task, and that is to work to keep this chair going in things like fundraising. So first of all, then, that word of thanks. And when I tell people, what I do, they say, like, where did you get a job like that? And all I can say is, I didn't create the chair, I'm just the beneficiary of it. Dr. Peter Craigie and early members of the Department of Religious Studies had the vision back in the early 80s. And here we are today, and I'm certainly grateful. I want to talk this evening about the topic of conversion. And I think one problem in choosing a topic like this is that you come, I'm sure, with all kinds of expectations. And I'm afraid that I probably won't do a very good job of fulfilling those expectations. I really have a very modest goal this evening, and that is simply to get a bit of a handle on what happens when people convert. That's really it. I'm not arguing if it's right or wrong. I'm not arguing if I'm not touching that issue really at all. I'm just interested in, what is this thing called conversion? Is it one thing? Is there, if you look at Christian history or look at the Bible or whatever, is there one thing, normative thing called conversion that we can derive from that kind of study or not? So that's one of the questions I want to consider this evening. I think I have a timely topic. If you attune yourself to the media at all, you'll know that there have been some pretty famous conversions lately. I'm thinking, for example, of Anne Rice, the novelist. I must confess I've never read a novel by Anne Rice. But I'm told she tells great stories about vampires and witches, and has been doing that for some 25 years or more. But this is the headline that maybe you saw in Newsweek last October. Anne Rice, Queen of the Occult, finds God. At age 64, this chronicle of vampires and witches has returned to the Catholic Church that she had left at the age of 18. And of course, there's a story. Therein lies a story. And she now says she will only write books for the Lord. She's not only made a turn in her faith, she's made a turn in her whole career. She will now only write books for the Lord. No more vampires, no more witches, as far as I can tell. I mean, there is a story there. She went into a diabetic coma back in 1998. Her husband of 41 years passed away in 2002, and she herself almost died after surgery, or in surgery. In 2004, went into a period of deep depression. And it's in this context that, as I said, she has returned to the Catholic Church and is now writing her first novel after this turn, is entitled Christ the Lord, Out of Egypt, a novel about the 7-year-old Jesus, narrated by himself. But it doesn't end there. Another famous convert is none other than Naomi Wolf. Naomi Wolf is considered the most widely read feminist of her generation. Maybe you remember her book back in 1991, The Beauty Myth, that was her indictment of the cosmetic industry and what it was telling women about what it means to be a woman. And of course, she opposed all of that. Well, recently in therapy for writer's block, and this is a story just from this past January now, recently she was in therapy for writer's block and was practicing meditation, and in the course of this, she had a vision of Jesus. She describes it as holographic. It was brilliant, illuminated, three-dimensional. It was just figure, she says, that was the most perfected human being that there could be, full of light and full of love. She says it was the most profound experience of my life. This is all the more interesting because Naomi Wolf is Jewish. She now says that she's not converted to Christianity, but Jesus of Nazareth does have her attention. And she's interested in him as a teacher, and as a rabbi, she believes she's on a spiritual path and is answerable to a higher authority for how she lives her life. The article concludes on a bit of a cynical note that in America, finding God appears to be an acceptable resolution to midlife crisis. But I'm not finished yet. Another famous convert, Antony Flew. And for some, maybe this is the most surprising of all, because Antony Flew is probably the most influential atheist thinker of the 20th century. A powerful opponent of religious belief. A leading British academic, he wrote two famous essays, one on this topic, one, Theology and Falsification, in which he essentially argued if there is no way to falsify the assertion that God exists, in other words, if you cannot explain the circumstances in which you'd be willing to acknowledge God doesn't exist, well, then your claim can't be taken seriously. If there's no way to refute it, no philosopher can take a claim like that seriously. His second essay, a later one, 1984, is entitled The Presumption of Atheism, and you can catch the point from the title. He argues in this essay that atheism should be our default position. The burden of proof lies with those who want to believe in God. They need to provide the evidence. Unless they can do it, we're justified in not believing in God. And as far as he has been concerned, up until recently, there was no such compelling evidence. However, as we sit here today, this evening, at the age of 81 actually, Antony Flew is now a believer in God. He admits that he now accepts that the existence of God is probable. And these are only for good reasons. This is only the basis of evidence. He's had no illumination like Naomi Wolf, nothing like that. He just, as a thinking man, now thinks there are some good reasons to believe it's probable that God exists. What are those good reasons? Well, he says the last 50 years of DNA research, for him, make the argument from design more compelling than it's ever been. He says if you pay any attention to that research at all, it gets your attention. You have to explain this intricacy somehow. And he now believes that God is probably the best way to explain it. He doesn't believe in the afterlife. So cynics, of course, are saying, 81 years old. God's got his attention finally. There's no selfish motive here. He does not believe in the afterlife. He hasn't found the evidence for that yet. Doesn't accept the Bible as revelation from God, nor the Quran. He's simply a kind of deist. That would probably be the best term. A recent article has observed that there have been some deists in the past for whom deism was a stepping stone to a full belief in God. And you just need to think of a person like C.S. Lewis to realize that that can be true. A person came to a belief in God thinking they would stop there, but then, as this article says, once you have a God, who's to say what he can and can't do? Maybe he does come to this world as a prophet, bring revelation, redeem his world. And so it will be interesting to see where Antony Flew ends up. But it's not just the rich and famous that are converting. A recent article suggests that while most religious people stay within their religious tradition for their lifetime, 1/3 of American adults have switched religions at least once. 1/3 of American adults have switched religions at least once. And there's an explanation for this. The argument is that where there is close family to support a religious tradition, people will stay in that tradition. Where there are not close family ties, people feel more free to leave the faith possibly in which they've been nurtured. So this is from a scholar from Notre Dame University. He finds that Catholics are less likely to switch their religious allegiance than other groups that have a very distinctive, peculiar kind of religious experience and are not likely to find that elsewhere, are not likely to switch. But I'd suggest this evening that it's not just statistics like this that get our attention, but I think this evening probably for many of us, the subject of conversion comes quite close to home. If not we ourselves, if we haven't had a conversion experience ourselves, doubtless we know of some friends or family who have. I confess that I personally have had a lifelong interest in the topic of conversion. When I was 11 years old, both of my parents had adult conversion experiences, and it had a fairly dramatic result. We stopped attending the United Church of Canada, where my grandparents attended and where my family had grown up, where I'd been baptized, and we started attending the local Baptist church. And that had some other implications. My dad and I no longer played cribbage. Cards were out of the question. No longer attended movies. So that was a conversion that had its implications, got my attention, I would say, as a young person. There are some other factors behind my choice of topic this evening. By the way, just for your interest, I'm still in the introduction, point 1. I've got another 50 minutes. Conversion is a part of Christian history. There are conversions in the Bible. Certainly, the book of Acts, there are some 18 times where, as you may know, in Greek, the word simply means turn. Some 18 occasions in the book of Acts alone, we have examples of people turning in repentance from sin towards God. And it is always presented as a work of God, a work of grace, that people experience this turning in their life. And Christian history is full of famous conversions. St. Martin of Tours, St. Augustine, who famously wrote his Confessions describing that conversion, looking back, now a bishop, looking back and recounting the story of his conversion. From being a young man who stole pears just for the fun of it, who had a concubine for some years, a woman with whom he lived, had a child, a Deodatus, and then in his 30s, started reading the Bible again, a book he had once disdained as a young adult, and heard the preaching of Ambrose, heard of another famous conversion, the conversion of St. Anthony of Egypt. With all these influences, he says, God called me to himself. God converted me to himself. It's interesting he puts it that way. If you know anything about Augustine, he's the theologian of grace, the Doctor Gratiae. And so he didn't convert on his own. God converted him. God turned him when he was happy to live his life without God. It's Augustine who famously prayed, Lord, convert me to yourself, but not yet. Well, eventually God did convert him. Other famous converts, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Dominic, the famous mendicant movements that followed them, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Not many conversions follow the conversion of St. Francis. One dramatic gesture of St. Francis to indicate his conversion was to strip himself naked in a court of law. His father had taken him to court because he was giving away cloth free. His father was a cloth merchant, giving away cloth to clothe the beggars. And so as a gesture to show that he owed his father nothing, he stripped himself naked and began his life as a beggar. Martin Luther, famous conversion. John Bunyan, John Henry Newman, a famous convert who converted from an Anglican position, an Anglican priest, to becoming a Roman Catholic, and eventually Cardinal Newman. A famous conversion that he described, in which he didn't describe, but he defended apologia pro vita sua, a defense of his life, and he's defending his conversion from Protestantism to Roman Catholicism. Thomas Merton, one of the most famous 20th century converts, sometimes called the Catholic C.S. Lewis, a very unlikely convert, born of artist parents, his father from New Zealand, his mother from America, born in France, where they both were artists, just traveling the countryside painting. And he and his brother, Jean-Paul, lived this footloose life. Unfortunately, for his experience as a child, his mother died when he was 10 and his father when he was 16. He ended up in New York after getting a girl pregnant back in England. Ended up in New York, went to Columbia University, and he became a Catholic Christian at Columbia University through English literature classes with Mark Van der Ren. A remarkable story. Thomas Merton, C.S. Lewis, Malcolm Muggeridge, the story goes on. Conversions are part and parcel of the Christian past. My own interest in things historical goes to the 17th century. Very good century for people interested in conversion. Because it's precisely in the 17th century, in the 1600s, the later 1600s, when Protestants become very self-conscious about their spiritual journey. And these, we call them English Puritans, German Pietists, central to their faith was a conversion experience. Absolutely central. This is a time of individualism. There are many options out there. How do you find assurance of God? It's by seeking assurance from God, seeking God's grace. And you get proliferation of conversion stories. Conversion became a demand. People needed to be visible saints. People needed to have a conversion story to be accepted as a member of a church at this time, a Baptist church or later a Methodist church or a congregational church. No conversion story? Have to go back to those Anglicans. We won't take it. Now, just a little bit of free advertising, I've written a book appeared at this time called The History of the Reborn. A man named Johann Henrik Reitz wrote a book of over 100 conversion stories. It was published in 1717. And I just happened to have written an article about this book, and if you want to get my article, you can purchase it downstairs. So that's Johann Henrik Reitz. Scholars are interested in conversion, and that's going to be the first part of my paper this evening. I might say that there are some scholars who are nervous about even talking about conversion. Conversion smacks of missionary triumphalism. It smacks of the kinds of unequal dynamic between the missionary and the poor, uneducated subalterns in other continents. And of course, there is much to criticize in many of those situations. So many scholars don't even want to talk about conversion, think about it. One British scholar, Richard Dawkins, suggests that those who would engage in childhood conversion are committing child abuse, that it's such an unequal kind of relationship. So obviously there is some discomfort with conversion in some quarters. And as I said, some of that we're going to leave aside. I'm simply looking at what happens when people convert. And of course, in many cases, conversion is a kind of auto-conversion. It's people on a search, and they experience changed lives. So my purpose this evening is a simple one, to ask, what exactly is conversion? What is it about? What are its causes? What are its consequences? Is conversion one thing or many things? And is the Christianity that people convert to one thing or many things? Now it gets a bit complicated. My thesis, my main argument tonight, I'll give it to you right from the start, and actually it's found in this little folder I hope you all got when you came in this evening. Under introduction point 2, I give you my main argument, which goes something like this. The meaning of conversion changes in different historical and social settings. That is because conversion experiences are culture dependent. The Christian message and the convert's response to that message, they both reflect the expectations of a particular Christian community in a particular time and place. So I'm certainly speaking as the historian here. So we can discuss this further, but first of all, of course, I need to present my case. I do think that conversion is a complex matter, that it's many things, and I do think there's an important implication, by the way, to this argument I'm presenting tonight, and that is, if we take this seriously, it should make us more welcoming people. If we can come to accept the fact there is no normative conversion that is to be expected, I think that will change our view of the Christian world fairly substantially. So let me begin then now with point 2, new insights into conversion. There are a couple of classic studies. I really, in a good conscience, couldn't really begin this lecture this evening without mentioning the name William James and Arthur Darby Nock. And just let me say that there is a huge scholarship on conversion. One scholar has actually called for a moratorium. He says, hold it, don't write any more in this subject. Let's digest what's already been written. There's just too much out there. So I think a lot of us in many of our fields wish that there could be a moratorium. Trying to keep up with the new scholarship is always intimidating. But that has been a plea, at least in this field, of conversion studies. I think there are some good reasons, by the way, why conversion has attracted so much scholarly attention, especially from the social sciences and history. Certainly the 70s and 80s. The 1970s, those of you that lived through the 1970s and 1980s, one scholar says at that time, North America was gripped by an epidemic of personality change. Do any of you know what I'm talking about? It was a wild place to be alive, the 70s and 80s, and 60s too, for that matter. This is the time when Chuck Colson converted. He wrote his famous book, Born Again. Nixon's right-hand man became a born-again Christian in prison while reading C.S. Lewis. I remember a friend that I went to university with, and I met him a couple years later, and he was a totally different person. I knew him as Don. He told me, as soon as we met, he told me, don't call me Don anymore, my name's Paul. And it became apparent that the Don that I had known just a couple years before no longer existed. He was a Christian, but a different kind of Christian. He'd been a Christian before, but a very different kind of person and Christian than I could remember. Well, that kind of thing happened. One scholar says it was like we were living in an age of conversion back in the 70s and 80s. And of course, the moral majority, the 1980s, evangelicalism coming into its own, many evangelical denominations having a conversionist theology. And of course, now in the 90s and more recently, the fastest growing form of Christianity is Pentecostalism. So again, you have a form of Christianity that is certainly interested in dramatic change, life change, conversions. So first of all, now just to these first two classic studies. William James wrote this book called Varieties of Religious Experience. It began as lectures, Gifford Lectures, published in 1902. James has two very interesting argument sections in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience. One section, one argument, has to do with what he calls two ways of looking at life: the way of the healthy-minded and the way of the sick souls. He taught at Harvard University and in the field of psychology. So he's interested in what makes for healthy and sick souls. So first of all, the way of life of the healthy-minded. He says these are people who are just born optimistic. They are born with a religion of pure natural optimism and moralism. They believe in living a good life, and they live a good life. They believe in being good neighbors, and they are good neighbors. The religion of the healthy-minded. Then, on the other hand, there's the religion, the view of life of people he calls the sick souls. And it's these people who are the twice-born. The healthy-minded are the once-born. The sick souls are the twice-born. And rather than a religion of pure naturalism and optimism, they have a religion of pure pessimism. Utter dependence upon God and supernatural grace. Without that, they'd be hopeless. The differences between these two really root themselves in how easy or difficult it is to rid oneself of evil and a consciousness of evil. And for the healthy soul, dealing with evil, just pull up your socks and deal with it. For the sick soul, it can never be so easy. It demands a dramatic turn. It demands a miracle from God, or will always be in the clutches of evil. Now, James has quite a generous comment to make. He is by no means favoring one of these two views of life over the other. Because in his thinking, you don't have a choice here. You're just one or the other. And he encourages us to accept one another. He says it's a better world that we have on the one hand a Ralph Waldo Emerson, on the other hand a John Wesley, on the one hand a D.L. Moody, and on the other hand a Walt Whitman. Our total consciousness of God would be diminished if we didn't have both, and to hear the view of God that both have to offer. So there's one, you can see the implications of this for conversion. The twice-born, those are the converts. The once-born, convert from what to what? There's a continuity of life. The second relevant argument in James Varieties' book has to do with two kinds of conversion. And here he speaks of those converts who have a voluntary, conscious conversion that usually is a gradual thing that takes a long period of time, on the one hand. On the other hand, a kind of surrender, involuntary conversion that is almost instantaneous, where one has a sense of being overcome and overwhelmed by the grace of God. Maybe more similar to, Augustine's maybe in between in some ways. And of course, there are different degrees of emotive involvement in these two forms as well. James gives examples of the instantaneous conversion. He thinks of revivalism. German Moravians, English Methodists, American and English revivalists are good examples of the instantaneous form of conversion, involuntary. This conversion is a miracle. And of course, he points out that from the revivalist mentality, this is really the only kind of conversion. This is the only kind of Christianity. And part of my purpose tonight is to ask if that is really so. James himself this is a comment by Knock, James was always attracted by cranks and geniuses and unclassified waifs, none of whom were impounded by conventional 90 and 9, walled in by historic creeds and codes. He was interested in the converts, in the twice born. Now, the other classic study is by Arthur Darby Nock, which was published by him in 1939. He wrote another famous book on conversion that came out about 1920 on conversion in the ancient world. His book ends with St. Augustine and the notions of conversion in the ancient world culminating with St. Augustine. Fascinating book. Well, this essay, Conversion in Adolescence, caught my attention, and I think it's caught a lot of people's attention. He begins with the assumption that in the Christian world, conversions frequently happen in adolescence. They frequently happen in these late teenage years as young people are sorting their way through life, dealing with all manner of crises and relationship issues and sense of direction. And it's common in many religious traditions for young people. In fact, many traditions expect that young people will either be confirmed or converted at some point during their adolescence. Now, the question of our friend Nock is simply, is there anything like this in the ancient world itself? Do Greeks and Romans have any sense in terms of their own culture of young people dealing with religious stresses and moral issues and anxieties? And what he actually found was no. You do have dramatic conversions in the ancient world. If you converted to a philosophical school, for example, the Pythagoreans or the Cynics, you would change your way of life. You would don a specific garb that identified you as a Pythagorean or a Cynic, and you completely change your mode of living. Only thing was that cannot in any way be identified with a particular stage of life, certainly not adolescence. In fact, in many cases, it was later in life that people would make those decisions. So those are our classics. Let me move now to some more recent studies in the last 25 years. And I begin, as you can see under point 2, John Laughlin's typologies of 6 conversion motifs. And just across the page at the top, you have a little chart in which he characterizes these motifs. The horizontal line gives you the 6 motifs. Intellectual motif of conversion. He believes that conversion experiences are not just variable, but dramatically variable. And variable in terms of what he calls their central experience. So, look at the numbers across the top, horizontally. There are the intellectual motifs and conversions. There are the mystical, the experimental, the affectional, the revivalist, the coercive, these 6. And then he simply subdivides those. And I'm not going to even worry about those subdivisions tonight. I'm interested in that top line, those 6 categories, and what he's getting at when he talks about 6 conversion motifs. He says, and he argues from his research, that conversions vary in a number of acute, qualitatively different ways. And he calls these differences different motif experiences. Now, the intellectual, for example, the intellectual is usually a person who, as he says, is a self-convert. This person is on a search, usually a drawn-out, lengthy search, weeks, months, maybe years. And it culminates in a moment of illumination and often results in entry to a religious movement at that point. So that's the intellectual. The mystical, of course, is the polar opposite. And he suggests that the mystical is probably the best known and may well be the form of conversion that comes to our mind most readily. Sometimes it's called the Pauline conversion, right? The Damascus Road conversion. Dramatic, full of emotion, quite intense, brief, over a very brief period of time, with the subject having a sense of being acted upon by a power outside themselves. So those are certainly 2 polar opposites. Then there's the experimental motif, which, as the name suggests, is a person who's a bit of an experimenter, a person who's marked by curiosity. And the curiosity gets them into a situation where they're starting to experience what religion, a form of religion, may be all about. And it's that experimental dimension that begins to carry them along. And over time, they say, this is for me. This works for me. And that is what he means by an experimental conversion. The affectional conversion is, according to Lofton and to others, well, actually, this would be some other commentators, the affectional conversion typifies the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where it's all about an emotional milieu. It's about people converting in groups. The Jesus people would be a great example. It's friendship evangelism. And it's through this emotional, personal friendship attachment that one gets drawn into a particular form of faith and converts. The revivalist, I think, goes without saying. It's a highly emotionally charged setting, a crowd, powerful speaking, preaching, music, and a revival meeting, and of course, emotionally charged and often instantaneous. And then finally, the coercive conversion. Sometimes this is known as brainwashing, which itself is highly controversial. Even Lofton admitted that this type is relatively rare. So the simple point here is that Lofton gets us thinking about this argument of his, that there is a range of types of conversion. No one type is normative. Conversion motifs, he suggests, differ from one historical epoch to another over time. So you look at a convert from 300 years ago, not likely it'll be just like a convert of today. But then even if you change within a particular time period today, change different social settings, different continents, different social settings, again, one can expect conversion to mean different things and to be experienced differently. Now we move on to Lofton and Stark, same man, teaming up with another scholar on what he calls 7 conditions of conversion. And this is based on a famous study of the Moonies. You think back to the 70s and 80s, and remember you go to the airport and you'd see these saffron-robed people, the Hare Krishnas. And I remember when I started going to graduate school at the University of Waterloo in 1978, I'd arrive on that campus, be met by a Hare Krishna at the front gate, passing out their literature. That was 1978, fairly late. So these new religions and the converts they were attracted scholarly attention. And Lofton and Stark wrote a famous article entitled Becoming a World Saver. And they examined these new converts of Seongmyeong Moon. And as they examined these converts, they believed they saw a pattern. And that pattern looked like this. There were 3 what they called predisposing conditions and 4 situational factors. And as these accumulated, the likelihood of conversion became highly likely. The three, and you can see the list I give you here under point 3. Lofton and Stark, acute tensions, religious temperament, becoming a seeker. Those are the first 3. Those are the predisposing factors. In other words, if you have conflict in your life, if your life is not working, something has to change. And if you have a temperament where you consider that maybe religion, you're not committed by any way, but you're thinking maybe religion, you should take a look at it again. So you put those things together. Your life isn't working. For whatever reason, you're at least willing to consider that religion might be part of your solution. And then, as you can see, thirdly, becoming a seeker. Now you're engaged in actually taking religion seriously enough to look at it. Those are the predisposing conditions. Now we come to the 4. You could be a seeker and still not end up converting unless some of these 4 start to click in. And those 4, as you can see, are turning point, effective bonds, loss of old attachments, intensive interaction. A turning point in terms of you've moved from just being a seeker to being pretty serious about finding your answer here. And lo and behold, you actually meet somebody who can provide you with some answers. That's the effective bond. So now it's not just you doing your search. You actually are now engaged with somebody who's got some answers for you and who can say things like, you know what? I know what you're talking about. You know, does this faith ever make a difference to me? And they start giving you the personal side of this faith. So that's the effective bond. And for these scholars, that's the key one. Of all the 7, that is the operational one. That's the axis. That's when a person is on their way to conversion at that point. And especially if one is then somewhat removed, for whatever reason, from the older attachments, and especially if there then becomes intensive interaction with other converts, you're well on your way to conversion. This is the way they analyze what was happening with the Moonies back in the 70s and the 80s. Now, critics, and they believe, by the way, that this model is universal. These are social scientists, these are sociologists, and they like it when they can find things that are universal. I'm an historian, and my job is to debunk people who think things are universal, to find a particular exception and to delight in that. And even other sociologists have looked at this and said, doesn't work for these people, doesn't work in that situation. The fact is that there are different, you look at the Moonies, that's a particular kind of religious conversion. What about non-communal groups? What about mainline religious groups? Idiosyncratic groups? There are many kinds of groups to convert to out there, and they have a different pattern. They have different conditions, different process, a different process of change. And so the critics are saying this is far from being universal, but even those critics say two of these conditions are actually right on. And those two are the effective bonds and the intensive interaction. The last one and the third last one in that list. Those two do seem to have wide applicability when you're talking about conversion. Now, this model has been attractive to probably one of the leading scholars of conversion today. This is number 4, Louis Rambo. And Louis Rambo has his own 7-stage model that has quite a close similarity to the one we just talked about. And his model is in the bottom left panel. You can see a sequential stage model, stages 1 to 7. That's Louis Rambo. And it's not greatly different from the one that we just talked about. Here you can see he has context, crisis, quest, that would be the seeker, encounters, interaction, commitment, and consequences. And so Rambo likewise then believes that this is normally a drawn-out matter. He likewise believes that this is an accumulation over time. And he also believes that he does not universalize this the way Laughlin did. He says this is going to look different in different situations. He just wants this to be a kind of grid that we will have to adapt. He admits this. We'll have to adapt it. We're looking at different groups at different times in different places. And that brings me now to an historian. Now we're really making some progress. Number 5, the Robert Hefner book, Conversion to Christianity, Historical and Anthropological Perspectives. They have a simple thesis to this book, and the thesis is actually my thesis tonight. That conversion assumes a variety of forms. It takes on different cultural shadings and different settings. And this is a fascinating book because it looks at Christian conversions in South Africa, Java, Mexico, the Amazon, Papua New Guinea, Central Australia, Thailand, and China. It does kind of case studies of all those different settings. Here's what conversion is in these different settings. So it's a fascinating book, and certainly helps to make the point that I'm wanting to make tonight. He suggests, Robert Hefner suggests, that conversion encounters are always at least two-sided. There's another thing about history. Historians, they like the numbers 2 and 3. Sociologists like the numbers 7, 8, 9, 10. Am I right, Irving? So my colleague Irving Hexham, he's not speaking. Anyway, two-sided encounter here. Social and intellectual, extrinsic and intrinsic. In other words, there's an external aspect to this. I think this actually sums up the last 2 points quite well, the last 2 people. All of this boils down to having some outside influences and some inside motivations, and those things converging in a conversion. That makes sense to me. And of course, the Spirit of God is at work in this from a Christian perspective as well. And so for Hefner, conversions are always dually constructed. You have the seeking of individuals, and you have the institutions, the settings, the culture in which people are doing their seeking. The most provocative part of Wood, this number 5 that I'm talking about, is him asking this question: so, is Christianity one thing or many things? If conversions have this wide variety, different trajectory, different experience, different consequences, what does that tell us about Christianity then? Is Christianity one thing or many things? Are people converted to a form of one overarching, unified Christianity? He calls it a metropolitan Christianity. Or to a culturally particular form of Christianity? He answers the question by saying he doesn't think that Christianity is a coherent world religion. He thinks it's rather a mixture of various myths, doctrines, rituals, worldviews, sociological elements in different contexts. I hope you'll ask me about that later. Let's move to number 6, Brian Stanley, Conversion to Christianity, the Colonization of the Mind. I found this to be the most provocative thing that I read in preparing for this talk tonight. Conversion to Christianity, the Colonization of the Mind. You'll note that it appeared in the International Review of Mission. The most stimulating work that I'm finding is by missiologists, people who are taking a fresh look, people like Laman Sane and Brian Stanley. Laman Sane we had here as a Christian thought lecturer. Maybe we'll get Brian Stanley here someday. Very creative thinkers about these questions. Also historians and also sociologists. In this particular article, he is interested in Christianity in Africa, in African missions. And he says the simple thing he wants us to do in asking about Christianity in Africa is to say, what does it look like from the perspective of the receptor, the African? So much of the scholarship has been about the missionary and the colonizer. And whether it's British colonialism or French colonialism, they go into an area and the colonizers go, the people who want to create their businesses go, the government goes, and the missionaries go. And he says, fine, we've looked at that, we know that happened, no question. But he says, nevertheless, what was that reception of Christianity about? What happened there? Were these people just blocks of wood? Where you bang them ahead with Christianity and they've got it, and they're just this total convert, just lapping in what they've been given? And he says, when you start asking that question, what is it that these people are accepting? He says, needless to say, these people are agents. Right? Other cultures are to be seen as agents. And the message that is given to them, they take on their terms. And for one thing, they get it in their language, right? One of the first things a missionary must achieve is translation. Well, now, as soon as that act of translation happens, the person's receiving this on their terms, not on the missionary's terms, in terms of their language, their culture, their metaphors, their worldview. And so Stanley is saying the dynamics of conversion, we look at it from the perspective of the receptor, make this a two-way kind of dynamic, not a one-way. In fact, Stanley goes even further. He says we now talk about the conversion of the missionary. Missiologists now talk about the conversion of the missionary. Because the missionary now goes, and as he is learning this language, living in this culture, he's converted. He has a new worldview. And I think we all know that's true. I need to be careful when I say this, but I've observed that it's often frustrating for the missionary to come back to North America. And very impatient, very frustrated with North American culture, North American materialism, you name it. It's clear that something has happened here, and it's a worldview change. The missionary's been converted. They went to convert, but they end up being converted. And Stanley simply, I think, calls a spade a spade. I'm not saying they've been converted to some other form of religion. You hear what I'm saying? Their worldview has changed. It's not just the tribe that has changed their worldview, maybe, with the presentation of Christianity. The missionary has changed. His worldview has changed. He is now presenting the message in the intellectual categories of the host culture. So this is stimulating stuff. This is a whole different way to look at conversion. And Stanley gives examples. He talks about the Baptist missionary who went to India, northeast India. This is the early 20th century now. And this missionary decided that he would give the heart of his own theology. He would preach, as soon as he could speak the language, he would tell of a savior from sin. That would be his message. Only problem was the people really had no clue what he was talking about. They had no sense of sin and felt no need of a savior. So he had to find another point of contact. So he presented Jesus as the vanquisher of the devil, the one who could bind this strong enemy, take away his armor wherein he had trusted, and make the slaves of that devil free. That communicated in spades. That was a message that was welcomed with open arms. There was a dual conversion going on there, is the way Stanley describes that. The idea of conversion is not simply the substitution of one conquering worldview over another. That is far too simplistic. And so I'm going to rest this discussion of, there are many books out there on conversion. This is just a selection. And many of these books are slanted at particular groups, converts to particular groups. And I've tried to choose ones that I thought had a relevance for us this evening. I hope that at least we can begin to expect to find some variation in conversion. Expect as we go to different cultural situations, we'll find that conversion, in fact, is a different thing in different settings. So let's give it a try. I don't think I'll get to the third example this evening. I want to look under point 3, many models. I want to look at a late medieval convert, Gerrit Grote, and in the Netherlands, a man from Deventer, and I want to look at C.S. Lewis. I thought I can't talk to this audience this evening about conversion and not make some reference to C.S. Lewis. But first we need to go back about 600 years to the year 1400. And what does conversion mean in late medieval Europe in 1400? Christian peoples have dominated Europe for centuries. All the major European countries have been missionized and converted by this time. And so a Christian would be hard-pressed, Catholic Christians would be hard-pressed to even conceive of somebody who's not a Christian. They would never even have met a convert. They're all baptized Catholic Christian believers. They would have read saints' lives, however, which would record some dramatic conversions from earlier times, martyr stories. And so they'd have a literary idea of these dramatic conversions of an earlier time, also in paintings, paintings of saints. But that doesn't mean that the concept of conversion was entirely unknown. In fact, the word convert was a popular one in that late medieval period. And what a convert was at this period was a person who turned away from this everyday, busy life, Christian life, to a special Christian calling. They turned away from their labor, from their family, from their parish church, to pursue a more intense form of religiosity. Freely chosen. And usually that choice, that conversion, meant following a rule and joining a particular religious order. And so John Van Engen, Notre Dame historian, talks about these as converts because they called themselves converts. Converts from a previous way of life to a way of life focused on God. They would take these vows into the religious order. It was a legal form of conversion, and it became well known. Many religious orders by this time in the late Middle Ages. In the earlier Middle Ages, pretty much it's just the Benedictines, Cistercians. But now by the late Middle Ages, you have the Mendicants, and you have a host of other orders by this time. These people are converts. There are the already converted, the baptized, but now there are these special converts, and they make the decision to move out of this everyday life, to pursue another level of religiosity. Now, the point is that had been going on for a while as well, but in the late Middle Ages, this choice to convert goes many different directions. Not just the prescribed orders, not just the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Cistercians, Carthusians, which had their rules, were papally approved, no problem. But all the possibilities seem to present themselves now without vows. So what would that look like? And the example I want to give of this, what Van Engen calls widespread experimentation. Widespread experimentation in this whole area of conversion. What does God want me to do if I want to follow him with all my heart? How do I do that? And they're not content with the old ways. Actually, there's a good reason why they aren't content with the old ways. Because monastic foundations have their own rhythm, like the Israelites of old, and they would be disciplined and prosperous, and they would decline and become undisciplined. And this is a period of lack of discipline. This is a period when many of these orders are not impressive. Dennis the Carthusian says, I'm embarrassed, not just by the state of the church. I'm embarrassed by the state of the religious orders. So that starts to make some sense. If you want to convert, and yet the religious orders are not a particularly respectable form of conversion for you anymore. They themselves need to be converted. What do you do? Now we're ready to talk about our convert, Gerhard Grote, who lived from 1340 to 1384, because that was the situation he found himself in. He was the son of a very prosperous Deventer cloth merchant. He went to Paris. His father could afford to send him from Deventer in the Netherlands to Paris to study law and theology. He's bright, eager, educated. His father could see him through in business as well. He's on a very good track. He's upwardly mobile. All right, we've got capitalism happening already in the Western world at this time, and things are looking very good for this young man, especially when you consider the small percentage of people that were even literate. This man, the world is his apple. Except, he already has a papal position, by the way. The Pope appointed him a canon of Aachen, so now he has a bit of an income independently. He's just not quite sure what he wants to do. Well, at the age of 32, 1372, he falls seriously ill. And it reminds you of St. Augustine. They think that St. Augustine became asthmatic. He had to give up his teaching as a rhetorician in Milan, and for physical reasons, Augustine could not lecture anymore. And a similar kind of thing happened here. Age of 32, he fell seriously ill. He retired to a Carthusian monastery, which is interesting. He never did become a Carthusian. This Carthusian monastery was in Arnhem. Arnhem today has the famous flower auction in the Netherlands. He went to Arnhem, to the Carthusian monastery there, basically to hopefully restore his physical health, but I think even more importantly, to get a sense of direction in life. He did not feel called to the Carthusians, but in an interesting event of providence, one of those Carthusian monks took a great interest in young Gerhard Grote. And he said to him, of course in Latin, alias homo fieri debis. Alias homo fieri debis. You need to become another man. You know, you can do much better than this. You ought to become another man. It's actually a very good definition of conversion. In response to that challenge, he completely turned aside from everything that had been part of his previous direction. Turned away from scholarship, turned away from studies. And he actually gave himself he wrote a resolution. He wrote it out. And he said, I will seek no further church appointment. I will not waste time in studying geometry, arithmetic, rhetoric, or astrology. Of course, these are the liberal arts he's talking about, which are reproved even by Seneca and are much more to be rejected by a spiritual man or a Christian. I will take no degree in medicine. I mean, that sounds okay, but listen to what's coming. I will pursue no studies to increase my fame. I'll avoid all public disputations, such as those in theology in Paris. I will not study for a degree in theology. He's decided that is not going to help him in terms of what he wants. He wants peace with God. He wants peace in his life. He wants to be at peace with himself. These resolutions became his rule. He never did join a monastic rule of any kind. Every day he read these resolutions. What he would not do, his resolutions also contain what he would do. He would commit himself to devotional reading. He would commit himself to serving the needy, commit himself to attending services, to fasting, and to simple living, a simple lifestyle. So this is a very original kind of conversion that we have here. He is what Van Engen calls a religious innovator. In this late medieval setting, when the options seem so unsatisfying, he turns neither to the parish, to the priest, nor does he turn to the religious order, the cloister. He finds a third way. It's a whole new form of community. And he established this community in his own house. He went back to Devonter, and he took his property and his house, and he just filled it with seekers like himself. And they became known as the brothers and the sisters of the common life. Martin Luther attended one of their schools. John Calvin attended one of their schools. And Erasmus attended one of their schools. Talk about having an influence. The brothers and sisters of the common life. And of course, if you look at this conversion, what was it about? Well, we have a vita of Gerard. In fact, there's a circle of some of us that read Latin together once a week. I think some of them might be here tonight. And last week, I persuaded them to help me read this vita, or at least parts of it. And in that vita, it reads simply as follows: God called Gerard, whom he had chosen for himself, from the way of iniquity to a life of holy conversation, through a religious man of the Carthusian order. Very concise statement of his conversion. God called Gerard, whom he had chosen for himself, from the way of iniquity to a life of holy conversation. And God did this through a religious man of the Carthusian order. How many converts have you met like that recently? Know any converts that God used a member of the Carthusian order to convert to himself? Anybody? Maybe there are some. You see what I'm saying here? That there is something special about this that I think for many of us who think in terms of conversion is not exactly the kind of thing that we maybe think of. I personally would call his conversion an experimental conversion on that grid at the top. An experimental conversion motivated by curiosity, a desire to experiment, find a new way of life. He just wanted to be free, to find God out of this conviction. I'm running out of time, so I don't want to stop. I don't want to get too caught up in this. R.W. Southern has a wonderful description of this convert, Gerard Grote, that I've been talking about. He describes him as just a young, footloose university dropout. And I think that probably is quite accurate. A young, footloose university dropout. And who wanted freedom to find God in new ways. Let's fast forward on our VCR to the 20th century, or almost the 20th century, 1898. A young man in Belfast, Ireland, is born, given the name C.S. Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis, a name that he hated, and about the age of 4 or 5 decided that his name would be Jack. And so everybody called him Jack Lewis. Jack Lewis has written a famous conversion story. I'm sure many of you have read it, Surprised by Joy, published in 1955. And he tells us what this book is about. This book is written to answer requests that I would tell how I passed from atheism to Christianity. The book aims to tell the story of my conversion. And a very interesting story it is. It's been one of my joys over the years to teach this book to university generations of students. And in that book, he tells 2 stories, really. He tells the story of a loss of faith, and spends quite a bit of time on that, actually. And then the story of his return to faith is the second part, 2 movements. It's clear, he says quite bluntly, at the age of 13, he went to a preparatory school, and at that school, he says, it was a disaster. I lost my faith. He says, I was not even thinking of ditching my faith when I went to that school at the age of 13. Within a fairly short time, it was gone. He says, the food was good, we were well cared for. I gather at that time you couldn't take those things for granted. He made rapid progress in his Latin and English studies, but he says, at this school, I ceased to be a Christian. Of course, he was baptized in the Anglican Church, but he says, at this point, I ceased to be a Christian. The process was complete shortly after I left. Now, the story of his return is so elegantly written, so honestly and thoughtfully written, that it really is a classic. And yet, I would suggest it is not your typical evangelical conversion story. And that if you doubt me on this, go back and read it again. For one thing, there's this huge gap between his conversion to belief in God. When I say huge, like 1.5 years or 2 years. Between his conversion to belief in God and his conversion to Christianity. return to the Christian faith. And the other thing is that his return to the Christian fold is accompanied by a very interesting search that combines elements of sharp thinking and reflection, but also imagination and emotion, because the theme really is joy. And through his life, he's had these fleeting moments of what he calls joy, whether in reading or in seeing a landscape or in different settings. Joy, it was there somehow for the grasping, but never quite. And so this story of conversion is about somehow attaining that joy that had just been fleeting and kept disappearing on him. And that is not a rational story, at least not entirely rational. Not irrational, it's beyond rational. So his story works at two levels. He says, my imagination was baptized before the rest of me. His imagination was baptized through his reading. George MacDonald was one of his favorite authors, but many other authors. He was a professor of English literature. His imagination was baptized, but coming to accept God was another story. And on one occasion, he remembers a crusty old atheist that he had long had a grudging respect for, saying that he wondered if the Christian story hadn't really happened. That in many ways it was a story that was so common throughout the pagan world that it wouldn't be surprising if it had really happened once. That was such a novel idea to Lewis. He had assumed, well, if every religion has this story of some rising God who sacrifices and redeems people, well, surely that just trivializes it. Why focus on this one? But it can have the opposite implication. If there is this clue, this hint throughout religious history about a God who cares enough to sacrifice himself to redeem us, then maybe a religion that explains in detail how that historically happened deserves our attention. And especially the fact that this crusty old atheist thought that that's exactly what might have happened. And so now Lewis has a whole different view. And of course, I guess the point I want to make here is this is not choosing one religion over all the others. Lewis never had that point of view, never had that kind of evangelical exclusivism that is maybe common for many of us today. It was actually the opposite, openness, that drew C.S. Lewis to Christianity and that he retained for his whole adult life. So here's quite a remarkable conversion in the setting of the university. And again, if you ask this question, were there interactive relationships, effective relationships? Indeed, there were. And if any of you know his story, you'll know that one of those effective relationships was with a man by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien, famous as the author of The Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien was a Catholic Christian for his whole life, had none of this up and down of C.S. Lewis, and was there as a constant companion on the journey with C.S. Lewis. They were both young professors at Oxford. They arrived in Oxford in 1925 together. Lewis's father died in 1929. In 1929, in conversation with Tolkien, Lewis came to believe that there was a God. And in 1931, he became a Christian and returned to the Anglican Church. And what I find especially interesting about the story I've just told you is that in the book, Lewis describes my conversion from atheism to Christianity, which is a wonderful story. It's not the story his brother tells. In the memoir of his brother to an edition of Lewis's letters, his brother says this: "My brother Jack's conversion seemed to me no sudden plunge into a new life, but rather a slow, steady convalescence from a deep-seated spiritual illness of long standing." He just finally came back home to a faith that was there in the beginning, and inevitably he'd come back to. That was kind of his brother's point of view. This seemed to me no sudden plunge into a new life, but a slow, steady convalescence from a deep-seated spiritual illness of long standing. All right, I'm going to rest my case. I think that conversion is an amazing phenomenon to study and to experience. But I hope we can see that it's not one thing. I hope we can see that through Christian history it has taken many shapes, many forms. And I hope this realization will move us to be more charitable and accepting of one another within the Christian family. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Doug. My name is Tinu Ruparel. I'm a colleague of Doug's in the Religious Studies Department and also a member of the advisory board. And I'm going to direct some questions tonight. Doug's kindly agreed to take some questions. We've got about 15 minutes or so. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. If you're brave, please stand up and speak loudly. And I'll ask you to keep your questions brief, succinct. We have Patty Ann at the back here, another member of the advisory board, and she has a microphone if you'd like to use one of those. So please just catch my eye if you'd like to ask a question. Right here in the front. Oh, sorry, we've got somebody in the back before you. Next one.
Yes, I'm going to tread into some fearsome territory here, but the chart that you describe involves some emotion, love, fear, etc. Those are not perhaps the emotions that drive, say, the North American economy. They are more venal, greed, pride, etc. Has anybody ever thought about the other side of these issues, if you're going to introduce emotion to conversion, that there may be some more difficult emotions that drive people to conversion, such as greed or pride or something of that nature?
Yeah. Just a brief answer. I think the point I've been trying to make is that there are many ways into the kingdom, and those emotions are certainly one of the ways, no question.
Hi, yeah. Yeah, my name is Oscar Feck. I study world history and especially religion. When I go back in history, when you go back to the Catholic or in the 1800s, they created so many religions, like you indicated also in the late 1900s. Conversions come from within. If you have a strong feeling, like you mentioned, Lewis, like Jack Lewis, I believe as strong as he does, it comes to you from when you have trust, faith in God. And you have to be clean. And you have to think clean, be clean. If you don't have that conversion, you're not going to go anywhere. Why aren't people doing it now? Is the world so corrupt that they are afraid to speak their truth because they might get hurt?
That's a good question, if I can answer that.
Sure.
I think it's easy to have the view that things are getting worse and worse and conversions aren't happening like they did in the good old days. I don't accept that. I think if you recall the way I began my lecture, there are some remarkable conversions happening today.
There's a question at the back there and one in front here while we try to... Oh, sorry, back first, sorry. You raise your hand, please?
You touched on worldview and how we have about sin and salvation, and some of the other cultures about fear and power. And I'm just thinking the number one country of origin now for all of our immigrants coming in are from China. And there's a lot of shame and honor, I think. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Do you want to elaborate a little bit more?
Well,
you're going in a certain direction with this, I think.
The Chinese have, to save face. So shame is a huge thing in that culture. And I'm just thinking there's an awful lot about honor in the Bible, about the glory and honor that goes to God. And I'm wondering if we in the Western culture have missed that, and if we can learn something from another culture.
Good. I'll just let your comment stand. Very, very well stated. Another reason to be open to the diversity of conversion and to the diversity of ways in which the message should be presented.
I'm Tim, and you can decline this question. Could you tell us something?
I thought we were friends up until now.
Could you tell us something about your own conversion? Is that a fair question? You can decline, see?
Oh, it's fair enough. You know what? I think one of the things that I've done in my life is change metaphors. And conversion is a metaphor that I'm not as comfortable with as I once was. I prefer maybe the metaphor of a journey. I don't think conversion applies to everybody. I guess I agree with James, there are the once born and the twice born. I would suspect there are many Christians here this evening who cannot talk about a conversion. It doesn't bother me. I hope I haven't given the implication that somehow this is a normative thing. I hope I've been saying the opposite, that conversions vary greatly. And, I guess as a Baptist boy, I'll just give you a little bit of autobiography to partly answer your question. As a Baptist boy, I went to a Presbyterian seminary, Westminster in Philadelphia. And there I'd meet one of my friends, a brilliant fellow who has spent his career as a Christian Reformed missionary in Africa, in Liberia. And I remember him just saying to me, I've always believed. He thanks God for a Christian family, and he thinks that he was raised in the covenant of grace in that family, and he's always believed. Now, of course, as a Baptist, the burden would be on me to say, well, no, you haven't. You had to be converted. I didn't say that. I'm actually quite moved by the way he just described this. And so this is a subtext tonight, I guess. I'm saying that conversion in general is not the only experience of God, that God uses families and many models.
More questions? Take over there.
Is it permissible to make comments rather than a question? I've never heard of that fellow, the Gerard Groot, or Grote, however you say it, but as you described him in his time of coming to conversion, what he wanted, what just leapt out at me was, that's exactly what St. Francis of Assisi was seeking. That was exactly what he was looking for. And he had no intention of founding a religious order. He just wanted to live a simple life and serving people. And so many young men were attracted to him that they were just coming in droves to him, and the bishops of the area started to complain to Rome and said, these people are making a nuisance of themselves, and get them into a community. Right. And that's how the order was founded, in my understanding. The other comment I'd like to make of your number 3 on Leland and Rodney Stark, and this one also leapt out at me because I've been in the addiction field for about 40 years. And this, to me, those 7 stages, whatever you call them, is what happens in Alcoholics Anonymous. In whether I want to call it a conversion, they use the phrases very simply, we are reborn. They say it, it's in their literature. And then they talk about, we stood at the turning point. And these are the stages they go through. They have 12 steps. This one has 7, but they're just elongate. That's what struck me when you were talking, Doug.
Okay.
So I just recently came from was in Central America over Christmas time, and was quite shocked to see, or surprised to see the amount of new religious movements in Central America. I was expecting actually to see mostly Roman Catholic, that sort of thing. And there's actually a lot of evangelical churches and that sort of thing. And one of the questions I had at the time was how much these groups, which I kind of identify with being kind of North American, could translate to a Central American context. So I guess my question is, how do we gauge transcultural conversion versus apostasy? And is that even a question that we should be asking?
It's a very difficult question. And this is the University of Calgary student here, by the way. So how do we decide when a cross-cultural conversion is, in fact, a conversion and not apostasy? Very good question, and I guess very carefully. I really can't begin to answer a question like that concisely tonight. I think it's probably going to be from within that culture, for one thing. It's not going to be the missionary deciding what. I think it's not going to happen that way. remember Elizabeth Elliot once saying, one of the concepts of popular evangelical Christianity is worldliness. You shouldn't be you can be in the world but not of the world. What does it mean for an Auca Indian to be worldly? South America. Interesting question. We can't answer that. I suppose maybe they could.
Dr. Shantz, I'd like to thank you for your lecture. I've been at many international meetings, and you always thank the person for their lecture, and then you say, but. but I don't have a but. I see this as a comment I'd like to make. There's something incarnational about this. It's an incarnational model. And I say that because the way you have described it, I think there are really two parts to it, and you've described largely the incarnational part where our experience is what we're directing our attention towards. And then there's that mysterious intervention of the Spirit, and you alluded to that earlier in your lecture. My point is that I think conversion, the way you've described it tonight and in these models you've suggested, is a larger part of our experience than just my relationship with God. It's how we as religious people from different denominations understand one another. It's by something going on inside of us and then meeting that other person. And I think it's part of the solution, if there is a solution that's necessary, to our future as a church, so that we are seen as more not unified in terms of government, but unified in terms of spirit, and unified in terms of our openness to the stranger. And by stranger, I don't only mean the people who walk by on our streets, but the people who we are turning off. And so there's conversion has to happen to us so that openness begins to exist. And maybe one of the primary issues where that lies right now in our day is the whole business of sexuality, human sexuality. Who am I as a male or a female?
Therein lies another lecture. Thank you, Tel.
Appreciated your lecture. Just thinking about the way that you term conversion as a journey, do you see any conflict in that with the way that Jesus presented conversion? Just thinking of what he said to Nicodemus, you must be born again. There seems to, maybe it's not, but it seems to me that he had a sense of urgency, and I just wonder if how that would correlate with the idea of a journey.
That's an interesting passage. You must be born from above is probably the best translation. And yet it's all about the Spirit who is behind this. The Spirit, I think in the same context, talks about the Spirit works where he will. This is not something that's readily manufactured, or it's really out of our hands, ultimately, I think is the point of that passage. It's not our doing, it's God's doing. So that I would suggest means that we just better keep our hands off here and again, not try to manipulate this or pretend we have a handle on it.
Further questions? We have some more time. A couple more maybe over there. Maybe you could just stand up and...
Thank you. One of the questions I have is most of the conversions you're talking about are individual experiences. And as I was listening, I was running through my mind about various group or corporate experiences, the bringing of the Orthodox Christianity to the Ukraine. You mentioned Papua New Guinea, a place I have some experience, whole villages converting either to one church or another, or to the cargo, to the following of the cargo, and more examples like that. Are these conversions of the same type that you're talking about? Can these models be applied to the community level instead of the individual level?
That is a very good question, and I think a simple answer would be that these models are applicable mainly to North American experience. This is my criticism of Rodney Stark. Rodney Stark actually has an article in which he looks at some of these mass European conversions. You know what? He won't have any of it because they don't fit his North American model of conversion. My feeling is, well, sorry, but since when does the North American model of conversion become the norm for looking at other centuries, other places? So you've raised a very good point. That is a huge limitation in much of the discussion I've had this evening, is that it has tended to focus on the individual, and If you know anything of the Donald McGavran and Peter Wagner writings and the whole phenomenon of people group conversions, which I'm sure Brian Stanley is aware of, and which I think he was thinking of probably as well. But you've made a good point, that really is beyond the scope of many of these theorists I've been looking at.
I want to thank you for mentioning the conversion of the missionary. I've been 15 years in the mountains of Peru, and I certainly have gone through that sort of conversion experience, living in a village setting and raising 2 boys. So it's been exciting to see where God has already been, rather than me bringing him to them, and seeing the power of God in different ways than I've never seen before. So it really helps me and forces me to rethink what the Word of God says and how the Word of God becomes alive and active in a culture. And it's no holds barred, and I had to start rethinking things all over again, and I began listening to what they were saying, and they had a great perspective. So Bible studies became something fascinating for me. They taught me how to do Bible studies. That was fun. So I do appreciate your comments on this. And I also recall C.S. Lewis, I'm not sure if it's a case of Christian behavior, I'm trying to remember which, in Mere Christianity probably, where he says that perhaps there's one road, and the road is that we're all on, and sometimes we may see certain people down that road, and sometimes they pass us by going the other direction. So it depends on which direction we head, and where that gleam of glory that we are heading toward or not. And I believe that conversion is a constant decision, a daily decision. And perhaps that's what that's what I was attracted to in Lewis and in George MacDonald. So I'm wondering how, in living out the day, where some Minnie Kuhn and others from a Cameroonian experience would say when she would always come back here, May Canada never become a mission field. Perhaps the conversion experience is something we need to reintegrate into our own thinking as the world comes to us and we are living in such a multicultural society, how we can listen to the cultures that are here and learn from their perspective of a God who really cares for all of us.
You covered a lot of ground there. I'll only make a brief comment. I'm resisting the idea that there's some conversion expectation that we need to be living up to that maybe other fields can tell us about. I resist that. North America has its own Christian trajectory and its own history, its own Christianity, and I don't think we can somehow pretend we're not what we are. Our Christianity is not going to look like Christianity in China or Christianity in Papua New Guinea, and I don't think there's any point in beating our breasts about that. So if I detect a little bit of a kind of a normative conversionism coming through here, then I would want to resist that. That's not where I'm going tonight.
I have one more question over there. Sir, you had one earlier?
If I could pick up on the corporate idea of conversion, that's something has been sort of buzzing around in my head for a while. The North American Anglican Church is seen as being in schism with the rest of the world over homosexuality processes. But I was wondering if that could be considered as that they were actually converting. It was a conversion process rather than just a schism.
I thought we were friends, David. I'll defer on that one. It's an interesting thought.
Actually, at this stage, I think I'm going to draw things to a close. You can hold his feet to the fire more downstairs. There's refreshments and books and articles you can have a look at. And it just remains for us to thank Doug for a stimulating lecture and to you all for very interesting questions. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a free copy for everybody of a published version of